Greetings everyone, and thank you so much for watching this video presentation. Let me first introduce ourselves. My name is Dr. Raisija Gloria Ledwaba, and I'm with Dr. Mary Clasquin. We are both lecturers for this module. I would first like to talk about the key materials that you'll need in order for you to pass the module. We spoke about it during the announcements and during the discussion forum. So today I want to formally mention the type of materials that you will need. Number one, you will need TAT letter 101, and you already have it. You already have TAT 001. You also need the study guide, which I think you all have it. And finally, you will need 2 readers. What I want to indicate is that there is no prescribed book for this module. And many of you have asked the reason why don't you have the prescribed book? The reason that I would like to provide today is that this module offers the basics of inclusive education. This basic information is found in those 2 readers that I'm going to talk about it when we proceed. And these 2 readers is Education White Paper 6 and the Policy on Screening, Identification, Assessment, and Support. So you can see that is the first one, Education White Paper 6. This document, I view it as a Bible for the implementation of inclusive education. It implies that each and every teacher who works with children, all children, regardless of their learning needs, either in preschools, primary schools, secondary schools, they must all have this document, Education White Paper 6. It is the document that mandates the implementation of education for all learners in South African schools. The second one, you must have the Policy on Screening, Identification, Assessment, and Support. This policy guides all the educators on how to screen, how to identify learning barriers, how to assess the level and support required by each learner, and also how to provide support. So it doesn't differ from Education White Paper 6. It means that the information in both documents support one another. So these are the 2 documents that have also been uploaded under your additional resources. So there's no student who can feel that he doesn't have the document or he doesn't know where to get the documents. All these documents, including others that will assist you to understand better this module, they are all uploaded under additional resources. Now, in terms of the assessment task required for this module, number 1, you have completed assignment 1. That is the first assessment task required for this module. So many of you have completed the assessment task number 1. And some of you are busy with assessment task, which is assignment 2. So meaning that you will require only 2 assignments, assignment 1 as well as assignment 2. And at the end of the module, you'll write the examination. So I must emphasize again that there is no portfolio for this module. It was just some errors. The portfolio is not portfolio. You'll be writing an assignment. So you write assignment 1, assignment 2, and finally you write exam. So that's all that you need to complete the module. Now, coming to the contents. I assume that you have completed assignment 1 as I've indicated. And when engaging with this module, you have seen that it includes 6 themes, but there are 3 main ones. Number 1, you have learned about the history of education in South Africa, as well as the policies that mandates a shift from discrimination to inclusion. So the history of education in South Africa, as well as the policies that guides how inclusive education must be implemented in South Africa. Number two, it includes the understanding of the concept inclusive education. What is inclusive education? That is the second key theme of the module. Number three, you have learned about, or you are still going to learn more about the models that guide inclusive education. Then you are also going to learn about the barriers to learning, which will be followed by the process of screening, identification, assessment, and support. You'll also learn about the different role players in the implementation of inclusive education. And finally, you will learn about the concept curriculum differentiation, the curriculum that is flexible to meet diverse learning needs of learners in all schools. So those are some of the key aspects that you learn in this module. Okay. Now, for this presentation, we are going to focus on three aspects. Firstly, we are going to talk about the history of education in South Africa. We'll also talk about the concept inclusive education. We'll talk about the differences between mainstreaming and inclusion. And Dr. Mary will continue with barriers to learning. So those are the four aspects that we are going to discuss today. And next week we'll focus on the remaining ones. Now the question is, where did inclusive education start? Where did it start? And it's one of the questions that we have asked in the study guide. But what I want to indicate to you today is that inclusive education globally, including South Africa, did not develop in a vacuum. It has been driven by various international and national policies, legislations, and movements that all mandate the elimination of exclusion and discrimination for learners who need additional support, including those with additional needs. So it was initiated by many movements, international policies, as well as the national policies. And just to mention some of the international policies, there are many of them, but here I've only listed three. For example, we have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have the movements such as the Salamanca Statement, as well as the Dhaka Framework of Action. So as I've indicated in the middle, that not all of them will be mentioned in this presentation or in your module. There are many, but I've just mentioned few of them. And coming back to the national policies. So these are the policies within South Africa that mandates that no child must be excluded from accessing education system. So some of those national policies, we have the South African Constitution, we have South African School Act, we also have Education White Paper 6, the one that I've referred as a Bible of inclusive education. And we also have the policy on screening, identification, assessment, and support. So those are some of the international and national policies that mandates that all learners must be included in the education system, and not only to be included, but to be to receive quality education. Now, coming back to South African education system, is that after 1994, there has been major transformation in the South African education system. The main one was the appointment of the two bodies by the Ministry of Education by then, and it took place in 1996. So the two bodies, I think, is the first part of your study guide. Speak about these two bodies. So the two bodies were the National Commission on Special Needs Education and Training, as well as the National Committee for Educational Support Services. So the role of this team was to investigate and make recommendations on all aspects of special needs and support services in education and training in South Africa. In other ways, they were asked to go out to the schools and investigate how education and support services were offered to all learners in South Africa. So that was their mandate. They were supposed to go out to the school and investigate and make recommendations on all aspects of special needs education and support services. So let's see what the two bodies found. They found that, number one, special education and support services have predominantly been provided for small percentage of learners with disabilities within schools. When we talk about support services, we refer to specialized services such as speech therapists, physiotherapists, family support, all those support services that will ensure that each and every child receive quality education. And they found that those services were offered to small percentage of learners in South Africa. For instance, let's say there were 100 special schools in South Africa. And out of these 100 special schools, only 20 schools received those special services. And you can see that a lot of learners didn't get, in particular, those who needed additional support. They didn't get that support that they required for their success or for the accessibility of learning or curriculum. So, and those support services, as I've indicated, were provided on racial basis, with the best human physical resources reserved for schools that catered for white learners, meaning that schools situated in poor Black communities were completely ignored. They didn't receive those specialized services. So specialized services, as I've indicated, were offered on racial basis. So in other ways, again, no services was offered for disadvantaged learners. The third finding was that most learners with disabilities have either fallen out of the system because there was no support provided for them. Others were mainstreamed by default and eventually dropped out of school. That was the third finding. The fourth one, it was that the curriculum and education system as a whole have generally failed to respond to diverse learning needs of the learners. So the diverse learning needs of the learners were just ignored. Education was offered like one size fits all, meaning that one size fits all approach was used. The way learners were taught, the way learners were assessed, the way the materials were provided for those learners, the learning environment, all the curriculum aspects you can think of didn't meet learning needs of most of the learners. And that is the reason it resulted in massive number of learners dropping out of schools. That is basically what I want to indicate, that learning needs of most of the learners were ignored, and most of the learners, again, were excluded from the education system based on their characteristics, such as cultural background, language of communication, socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities, and disabilities. So based on those characteristics, many learners' learning needs were ignored. So in summary, many learners experienced barriers to learning, and those learning barriers were not attended to. And after the findings, the two bodies came up with some recommendations. The first recommendation was that quality education should be provided for all learners, regardless of their diversity. The second recommendation is that, or was that, because this task was completed many years ago, was that the identification of barriers to learning and development should be identified as soon as possible. The third one, learning environment is supposed to be free and be accessible for all learners. The system must develop a curriculum that is more flexible, which refers to the teaching. How do we teach? It must be flexible, our teaching methodologies, our assessment, the materials, the learning environment must be able to meet the learning needs of all learners. The rights of families, educators, and learners should be prioritized. We usually say in one of the African sayings, we used to say, it takes a village to raise a child, meaning that parents must be considered because teachers will have to work with them. The learner as well, the community as well. So those are the people that needs to be considered as important role players in the education system. The two bodies also recommended the development of programs for educators, which implies that our teachers must be developed time and again. They must be developed on inclusive education practices. They must be developed on how to address various learning needs of all learners. The support services and human resources to support all learners should be strengthened. And the last recommendation was that the intersectoral collaboration must be promoted, meaning that there should be a collaboration between various sectors such as the Department of Education and Department of Health, Department of Education and Department of Social Development, Department of Education and Department of Safe and Securities, and many more. So the intersectoral collaboration should be strengthened. So those findings, as I've indicated, and recommendations by the two bodies resulted in the development of inclusive education policy. So the two bodies came up with the findings, and they also came up with the recommendations. And based on these two aspects, the Ministry of Education developed inclusive education policy, which is Education White Paper 6. I hope it is clear now. So why did Education White Papers, why was it developed? Why inclusive education was developed? So as I've indicated, it didn't develop in a vacuum. It was developed from the findings made by the two bodies. Now, there comes a concept itself, inclusive education. What is inclusive education? And hopefully it's one of the questions that was asked in assignment 1. And I understand most of you got it right. So inclusive education, as we usually say, it is a buzzword due to many definitions and understanding attached to it, meaning that everyone understands it differently, or it is understood differently. It is implemented differently. But in summary, inclusive education is an education framework that ensures access to education for all learners. It's an education framework that says all learners must access quality education, regardless of their differences, such as cultural practices, race, language, abilities, gender, socioeconomic background, so on and so on. So regardless of this diversity amongst learners, all learners must be provided with quality education. In other words, inclusive education sees education as a fundamental human right where all children should be accommodated regardless of those aspects that describe their diversity. So I can say, regardless of their socio-economic status, regardless of their physical, intellectual, social, emotional, linguistic abilities, learners with various abilities as well, those living on streets, children from disadvantaged or marginalized areas. So all those learners must be provided with opportunity to access quality education. So in order for us as teachers, or in order for the education system to implement inclusive education, the following must be done. Or inclusive education requires the following. Firstly, it requires that we must all acknowledge that learners can learn. All learners can learn and all learners need support. Number two, we need to accept and respect the fact that learners are different in some way or another. They are different. And as a result, their learning needs will also not be the same. So that is the main thing that we need to accept and respect it. The third one, the education system as a whole, learning methodologies must meet learning needs of all learners. We must also accept or acknowledge and respect differences amongst learners. That is what I spoke about. And also that learning occurs at any time, either formal sectors, formal setting, or informal settings. Another thing that I want to indicate is that if we work with children, we must make sure that our attitudes, our behaviors, our teaching methodologies, the curriculum as a whole, as well as the environment, must meet the learning needs of the learners. Our attitudes, the way we believe about learners. We must believe that no child is unable to learn. We must also believe that all children need support. And even the way we behave towards those learners, the way we teach those learners, the curriculum as a whole, which will include assessment, which will include the teaching resources, teaching and learning resources, and the environment itself must be structured in a way that they meet the needs of the learners. We must again ensure that we maximize participation of all learners during our teaching and learning. Finally, our learners must be empowered so that we can develop or we can strengthen their strengths. What is the difference between the two? What is the difference between mainstream and inclusive education? When we talk about mainstream education, is the education system that accommodates all learners, but those learners must fit into the education system. While on the other side, inclusive education is about recognizing and respecting diversity of the learner population. Again, mainstream provide extra support. Okay, we have learners in my classroom, but those that can fit in the classroom, then the teacher can provide them with extra support. So to ensure that they fit or they are integrated into that normal classroom. If the learners experience some challenges, so those learners must be diagnosed. The system must see what the problem is with the child. Not the problem with the system, what the problem is with the child. So the child must be diagnosed. and prescribe the type of of school that the child can go. For example, if the child takes time to understand some concepts, if the child takes time to finish some tasks, so that child must be assessed to see what the problem is with the child. And if the child continue to experience that problem, or if the child continues to show that he doesn't fit into the system, then that child must be placed somewhere. So there's nothing wrong with the system. The only thing that we feel has a problem is a child. While when we talk about inclusive education, the support is on the whole system. So we support the whole system so that they can be able, or the system can be able to support that child. So that the system must be able to meet the needs of the child. So that is inclusive education. And again, inclusive education's focus is on overcoming barriers to learning, which Dr. Mary is going to talk about. So inclusive education must identify barriers to learning and overcome, or to eliminate or remove those barriers to learning so that the child can be able to access curriculum, so that the system can be able to meet the needs of the child. So the focus again is on how to make the system adapt to the needs of the child. That is what we mean when we talk about inclusive education. So let's see what we did in this presentation. So we spoke about the history of education in South Africa, as well as some policies, international and national policies that mandate the elimination of discrimination. We spoke about the concept inclusive education. We finally spoke about the differences between mainstreaming, as well as inclusive education. I think that's all about what I was supposed to do with you, and we are going to attend to the next part, which is barriers to learning. Thank you and goodbye.